This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the third part of the 8-part series, Writing the Dissertation, hosted by UWC Graduate Services. My name is Kristen Gilder. I'm the Graduate Services Coordinator, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Emeritus Patricia Roberts-Miller, who worked and taught in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing, and is a well-accomplished and well-published academic. Her last 2 books, Rhetoric and Demagoguery, was published in 2018, and then Demagoguery and Democracy was published in 2017. And Trish, I think as you explain it, you write about train wrecks and public spectacle. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But we are very excited to have her with us here today to talk about the dissertation as a genre and some of the things that you can expect when writing it. So thank you, Trish, so much for being here.
It's really fun. Kristen asked me to do this because I just love doing this. And I love it partially because so there's really interesting research out there about graduate studies and graduate school and who succeeds in it and who doesn't. And what people are starting to talk about or have been for a while is there are 4 kinds of knowledge that you really need. And one is discipline knowledge, and grad schools are great at that. They're really good at giving you the courses that you need and the concepts that you need. There's professional, and I think grad schools are getting much better at that, at providing professional assistance and advice about what conferences to go to and stuff. And then they're usually separated, but I kind of think that think of them together as rhetoric. So there's how you make the arguments that you're making, how you write the dissertation, writing processes that are helpful, that aren't, but then also just how to think about what it is that you're doing. Because most of us got to grad school because we're good writers, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't a good writer. But you were good at writing a certain kind of thing, and suddenly there's a new genre that you have, and people don't tell you that it's a new genre. They often expect you to infer what it is. So what I want to do today is talk about how you infer genre, and what are some things that you can look for, and what are some of the big differences that that you can have. A lot of advice that's out there about academia and graduate school is tremendously useful for one genre or for one discipline. It's useful. It wouldn't be there if it weren't, but it might not be useful for you. And so I think it can be helpful for being able to pick up genres, so that also you can be like, thanks. Okay, so what I want to talk about today are some things about genre that you can pay attention to. But what I also want to say, and I know that Kristen had one workshop that was very much about this, what I have found is that an awful lot of people succeed in graduate school through panic. That's actually how they succeed in academia, is that there's a lot of shaming self-talk, and a lot of, oh my God, if I don't get this done, I'm going to die, and that's what gets them worked up so that they can write. That's a strategy a lot of us adopt because being basically good writers, we sit down and we're like, okay, I'm going to write an article. And we're thinking about what's the overall argument of this article? What does the first sentence do? Where am I going to publish this? You're thinking about all of these things at once, and it's too much. And so you just get sort of paralyzed. And so what happens, and I think the worst part of that is the self-shaming of the like, oh, this sentence sucks, I can't write. And so what happens then is we use panic to silence that kind of critic and get us to at least write something. So one of my hopes for you is that you can find writing processes that don't require self-shaming or panic. I think that's, really good way to do it. I will also say that I've long been a really good writing teacher, and I'm a good writing teacher because I'm a bad writer. And it was sort of liberating for me to be able to acknowledge I'm just not a good writer. I'm a good reviser. By the time stuff gets to the end, it can be pretty good, but the first 4 or 5 drafts are really terrible. But that means I know the steps that you take to go from a bad draft to a better draft to a better draft. And I think that's really helpful. So I do think an awful lot of the people who write a lot and who have healthy relationships with their writing are just really comfortable writing badly. I'll tell you one more story and then I'll start this stuff, but also feel free to make comments at any time or ask questions or so I thought it was really interesting when I realized at a certain point, I'll spare you the long history, but essentially paper was expensive for a long time. And so we developed this writing process that was dependent on doing, composing in your head, and you didn't start writing until it was pretty nearly a final draft because of the expensive paper. That changed toward the late 19th century. It especially changed once we started using typewriters. But still, it's really, if you're typing something out, if you have to retype it, if you change your introduction, you have to retype the whole thing. So we still held on to a very linear writing process. And we held on to a very linear writing process until about the 1960s, when people started talking about teaching a more recursive writing process. That's what actual writers have been doing for years. Jane Austen has stuff crossed out in early drafts, but we didn't teach that to students. So we now have this opportunity to move stuff around more, right, and to use computers in a way that makes that easier to do. Okay, so one thing I just want to run over a little bit is that the major differences in the various fields are one form, and that's why I was asking you about the sociology one, because I'm the only people I've known in sociology, their work has been qualitative, so I wasn't sure what they do with quantitative. So in some fields, you have the single argument, the dissertation is a proto book, and those are going to tend to be fields that are themselves book fields. Then there are some where it's a series of studies, and so each chapter could be broken off and turned into an article, or may even have been published during graduate school as an article. And what's interesting is, and this is important if you ever choose to work at the Writing Center as a consultant, but that even so I'm in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing, but our grad program was actually in English. That's my dog's getting fed. And so English there are a lot of people doing linguistics in there. And it was really interesting. The people in linguistics, they did studies. They did these, each chapter was a very different study. And then also length is wildly variant. Linguistics is another one that, depending on if people are doing certain kinds of research, their dissertation may be 80 pages. Math has really short dissertations. There's nobody here, I think, from math. And history tends to be very long. So that's something that you want to be aware of, is what's kind of typical in your field. And I know that Kristen emphasizes that a lot, and that when you look at dissertations as models, you want to look at crappy ones too. Not just not just the ones that won prizes or something. Those are great and you should look at them, but it's also useful to see what's good enough. And because a good dissertation has 4 signatures, and that's it. But also what it will give you an idea about is stuff like length. And then also organization varies a lot. So I notice we've got somebody from education, that those dissertations have a chapter that is the lit review. the only discipline I'm aware of at UT that has that particular genre for their dissertations. And there are historical reasons and all sorts of stuff, but that's a, you know, that's a thing that's there. And then some dissertations have what's called IMRD. And it was a linguist who figured this out. And IMRD is you got an introduction, and then your methods section, and then your research, and then your discussion. So some dissertations are structured that way. And then that it's just that that research section is really long. And for the fields that tend to do it that way, your prospectus exam will often be just the introduction and the methods. And lit review is going to be part of the introduction. Some dissertations, you have an introduction, and then each chapter is an introduction for that chapter, methods, research, discussion. A lot of dissertations, the introduction is lit review and methods, and then each chapter is research, discussion, research, discussion. So if you have questions about how to identify those, yeah, Kristen put it in there. In some fields, especially humanities, methods is not a separate section. It's tremendously important in quantitative research that it's a separate section. One of my favorite people is actually a sociologist to talk about writing, and it's Mark Music. And he says, you know, a good methods section should be like a cookbook. You should be able to pick that up and replicate that exactly, know exactly what you're doing. But that's in the humanities. I think that we have a tendency to have the methods indicated by who you cite and what terms you use. So if you start talking a lot about articulation, then people are going to be like, okay, Marxist. Or deconstruction, you're going to start citing Derrida a lot. So for us, methods and lit review are pretty entangled. Methods are sometimes indicated in footnotes too, as to how you do those. And the research is also, I think this is so interesting. The research is pretty clear that conclusions to dissertations tend to be very short. And it's because, as one scholar puts it, once you've gotten over the line, once you've crossed that line, you've actually, you don't take a victory lap. So yeah, so conclusions tend to be pretty short on dissertations, and that's fine. It's also hard as a dissertation to know how this fits in the field. And that's often what a conclusion does, is it says, how is this really going to change the field? And you don't know the field well enough. What we often say to students is that your research should fill some gap. And so the classic introduction has the 3 stages. Here's the field, there's a gap, here's how my research is going to fill it. I think that's really hard for graduate students, unless you're doing quantitative research where you can really say, here's this very specific research that's been done. Here's one area it hasn't been done in, and I'm going to do that. The reason I think that's hard is I think we have too broad a notion of the field. So in my area, rhetoric, that's not my field. I'm not going to ever write a book or an article that changes the field. I'm going to write something that people who see themselves as engaged in pathologies of deliberation, that it's going to make some changes to that field. Does that make sense? I only have a few people who can nod, but anyway, so what part of what you're learning in grad school is what's your field. And again, it's not sociology. It's going to be, it's not history. So somebody's writing about the idea of the national interest. That might be American history, right? It might be political history, and those are 2 different fields. And the way you know what the field is, what conferences, and what panels at conferences. So American Historical Association, massive conference. It's kind of the equivalent for that field. In my area, it would be Modern Language Association, huge conference. You don't go to all the panels. So what panels do you go to? And that's the conversation that you're joining. The reason I'm making a big deal about that is I find that's kind of liberating for students, because students, when they think they're supposed to change the field, get, again, a sort of a paralysis. Which brings up the issue of what is expected of junior scholars. So you guys are junior scholars. And what's really difficult, and I say this all the time, what's really difficult about being a junior scholar is you don't have templates for what junior scholarship looks like, because you don't read a lot of junior scholars. In grad school, you read the big names, but you can't write like Derrida. I mean, maybe you shouldn't anyway, but you know, that's just not something that, when people reach a certain stage, they can make these broad generalizations, they can make big claims about the importance of their work, they can rely on personal knowledge, they cite a lot less. That's really clearly documented that you know, major scholars cite less. So, and you'll also notice they publish less in blind review places because of that. So it's really, really helpful for you when you're thinking about trying to find a model, is to look in journals that you think you might publish in and look for junior scholar work. And then when you do that, you want to look at things like, how long are their introductions? How long are their lit reviews? As I said, literature reviews are much longer for junior scholars than they are for very advanced scholars. Some fields like, religious studies, archaeology, you cite stuff going way back. You know, in religious studies, they will cite Josephus. In some fields, you really are not supposed to cite something that's over 10 years or something, unless it's Weber. So those are also things that you want to look at, is what are the implicit expectations about length of work cited and how new it is. I mean, you know, how recent all that work is. There's also, you get a lot of bad advice about originality. And in some fields, it's important to be original. Very few for a dissertation to be original. It's great if it is, everybody loves it. But what's actually expected is what's called the additive stance. So junior scholars tend to add to knowledge. There are few exceptions: law, communication. You're expected to take a much more what's called refutative or argumentative or assertive stance. You're really supposed to disagree with people and you're supposed to prove somebody wrong. Philosophy, especially if it's in the analytic, the Anglo-American analytic tradition, but we don't have any philosophy, do we? So yeah, so that's also something to look out for. There's some fields where people appear to have a refutative stance. They'll say this is going to change how we look at things, but it's the work's actually additive. Do those terms make sense? Do you, like, if you want me to define additive or refutative, just say so in the chat. Another kind of junior scholar work that is very popular in some fields is methodological. So Mark Music, to go back to him, co-authored an article that is one of the most cited in his area of sociology of religion. And it's just a methodological. It just says, here's a way that we can study this thing. And that can make a major contribution. So in some fields, that can be a really, really important thing. What that means is sometimes when you're writing a dissertation, you don't solve the problem. What your dissertation contributes that's important is pointing toward this method as a way that we will be able to solve the problem. For the 3-minute thesis a couple of years ago, I was working with somebody who was doing his dissertation on I love working on the 3-minute thesis because you meet these people. He's doing a dissertation on the algorithms that they use for TxDOT for figuring out what to charge people for the toll on something like MOPAC. So I think he was in computer programming, maybe. I can't remember what field he was in. But anyway, he didn't solve the problem, but he came up with this really neat way that people should be approaching that problem. And it was a great dissertation. So, you know, that's something that you can do. Also, another kind of dissertation that works in some fields and not others is taxonomic. And so taxonomic dissertations are ones where you say, it's sort of a giant lit review in a way. So it's a dissertation. I feel like one sees this in political philosophy sometimes, sometimes in rhetoric, but the dissertation itself says our field divides into 5 categories. And that's the work that it does. It isn't even necessarily critical. Those are kind of going out of fashion. So if you think you might be headed toward that, you want to check and make sure that that's going to work. But it's kind of specific to some things. And then another kind that's really popular in philosophy and literary theory is the prior question dissertation, where you say, you know, everybody's approached this. See, that's, now you're looking at Ruth. Hey, Ruth. Everybody's approached this way, and I think that we're jumping past a really, really important question. I worked with a student a couple of years ago who was doing really cool stuff on hip hop and queerness, and it was really neat. But that was the kind of move that he was making, as far as saying, okay, we've applied certain notions about queerness to certain kinds of hip hop, including, I can never say their name, but it's the people from Atlanta, and we've jumped too fast with the definitions of queerness that we're using. Also, what you want to look at is tone. Now, what I mean by that is, so we've got this thing of additive versus, say, refutative. And in some fields, you might have a refutative stance. You might be saying this group is wrong or this approach is wrong, but you're still expected to have a very deferential tone. And again, you can only know that by looking at stuff that's been published by junior scholars. So what that would mean is there'd be a lot more hedging. So a lot more, this might be this way, it seems that way, this suggests. The verbs that you would use would be along those lines. In some fields, and the Anglo-American analytic field is this way, communication is another one that's this way, they hate those verbs. You prove things, you disprove things, you demonstrate things. And it's interesting how angry people get about your using what they consider the wrong verbs, but anyway. And then there's, and Kristen has access to all this stuff, but there are some really good books that have done great analysis of how junior scholars do certain things, like book reviews. So book reviews are expected to be critical in some sense, but this one linguist looked at the different ways that junior scholars do it's critical, but there's no political risk to it. So those are the ones where you say, you know, did a great job with this. Unfortunately, they didn't have time to talk about gender, and I wish they talked about gender more. So that sort of wishing that they'd done more is a classic way that junior scholars can fulfill the genre requirement of criticism, but without it's not as risky. In some fields, the formality is, you need to be very formal, and in other fields, not so much. In my field, in rhetoric and writing, the subfield that is about the teaching of writing, a lot of people are advocating scholarly articles written in African American vernacular English, for instance. And so that's acceptable in my field, and in certain, especially in certain journals. In other fields, that's not going to fly at all. So, you know, you sort of want to know about that level of formality. I will say, in terms of writing process stuff, I think it's really great not to worry about formality at first. And particularly for job materials, the advice I always give students for writing job materials is write it as an email first. Your first draft is an email, and it's an email to your favorite undergraduate teacher. and you're just telling them what it is that you've done in grad school. And it gets, it changes audience. And that's the, oh, okay, I'll talk about lit reviews in a second, but I want to talk about this thing one more time. It's very easy to take writing and make it more formal. It's very hard to take formal writing and make it less formal. So a first draft being super informal is a really, really good strategy. And a friend always describes it as he talks about the narcissistic pleasures of the first draft. The first draft is for you. It's just getting down on paper, here's what I'm thinking about this. It's kind of exploratory. I find in my first drafts, I use a lot of suggest, pursue, explore, those sorts of verbs, and speculating a lot. A first draft also has a lot of scaffolding. So that I love the metaphor of scaffolding. So scaffolding, is something that we put on a building while we're building it. And we do that, you need external scaffolding because one, the structure itself is kind of weak. And two, it doesn't have elevators or stairways. So the scaffolding is what gets you places. So your first draft doesn't have transitions. It doesn't have any elevators or stairways. And so that you provide the scaffolding by really wooden statements like, my next topic is, and this brings up the issue of, my reader might be wondering, and leave it, go for it. And then as the structure strengthens in a second or third draft, you'll be able to remove that scaffolding in favor of a different kind of what's often called meta discourse. So meta discourse is when you say the next topic or whatever. So, give yourself lots of permission on early drafts. Depending on who your committee is, see, I'm retired, so I can be impolitic. Depending on who your committee is, you may or may not want to share that early draft with them. And that's just, some people can't keep themselves from correcting everything. They can't talk, with my students, when they bring in a first draft, I'm focused on higher order concerns. Is the question posed in a way that's productive? Have they read the stuff that they need to read? Is the overall organization, the right proportion? And then on a second version, then you start to move down to, so it's pretty late on that you're worrying about what verbs people are using. Some people can't stop themselves from correcting every single thing along the way. And so if you give them a first draft, you'll make them crazy. And academics are already weird enough, so that you don't need to help. Okay, last thing, lit review. The literature review is one of the most intimidating things for graduate students. And it's intimidating for perfectly good reason. For one thing, every sensible human has imposter syndrome. And if you don't, then you're a narcissistic asshole. So imposter syndrome comes from the fact, it's just a fact that we're claiming more knowledge than we have. It is not possible for us to read everything that we should have read before writing. And if you did, by the time you finished reading everything you should have read, more stuff would have been published. So there's always a sense in which we're pretending to be more certain than we are. We're making claims that may or may not be entirely true. And so that's just it. The literature review in a dissertation functions in a different way from how it functions in an article or in a book. In a dissertation, there's a certain amount of in-group performativity that you're showing, I'm a member, I know what this group is supposed to look like, I know what stuff I'm supposed to cite, I have read all the stuff I'm supposed to cite, I can relate it. So you've just got a ton, you have a whole lot more citations in a dissertation than anybody wants in a book. And if you have the kind of conferences where you have publishers who will come and have panels about what they're looking for, that's one of the first things that they'll say is that the lit review for a dissertation gets cut in half. So the literature review, and this is where that refutative versus versus additive really comes up. The literature review serves the function of indicating what conversation you're in, so which panels you're going to, and why it's an interesting problem. The way that most of us wrote through high school, undergrad, and even a fair amount of coursework is you've got a very, very limited amount of time to write. And so the first, you sit down, the first thing you think of is, what's my argument? And then once you figure out your argument, then you figure out how I'm going to organize it, and what I'm going to quote or whatever. In academia, the first thing you want to figure out is, what's your question? And I emphasize this a lot. And if you watch some of the other videos that Kristen has had me do, this is just what I talk about. What's your question? And so you need to be posing a question that is interesting for people, that is not obviously answered. There's not already an obvious answer. That's what the lit review does. The lit review doesn't, in a book or an article, it doesn't just show that you've read what you're supposed to have read. What it actually does is it says, this topic is interesting to people in this subfield, and they haven't solved it. So the lit review leads to a question, if that makes sense. I mean, it can be a statement, but the statement is going to be, while our field has heavily researched this area with great results, it hasn't taken that work and applied it to the next era, the next step, a contiguous question. So that so I hope that makes sense. Kristen is going to talk some about templates, essentially, and they can be really, really helpful ways to think about, instead of feeling like you have to make this great assertion that if you play kind of academic Mad Lib, so you have something like, although at first it might look like this, when you look more closely, you see that answer isn't adequate. Although the field, although there's a consensus that that Hamilton and Madison first formulated the concept of national interest in American political history, this leaves out the contributions of, I can't think of someone else in that area talked about national interest. Frederick Douglass, I don't know, he's much later, but anyway. Yeah, or although people have talked about national interest purely in very established nation states, we haven't discussed it much in non-Western states. So yeah, so those sorts of templates can be really helpful for getting you out of the one way of thinking about your topic. We have a tendency to get stuck because we look at a topic from one perspective. And so what I think the templates can do is they get you to kind of turn the thing and look at it from a slightly different direction. And that's the goal. One of these days, I really do have to try to figure out what the math is. But so I've done, I don't know, 4 academic books, maybe 5, and 2 books that are more like trade. The one just came out in January called Speaking of Race, which is a book. It was really fun to write. It kind of came out of teaching, but it's a book that's actually intended for that very nice aunt that you have who says, I don't see race. Anyway, so it was really interesting for me trying to write for that kind of audience, for someone not at all scholarly, not an academic, not an expert. And it was interesting that for me, I spent a huge amount of time thinking about tone, whereas with the more academic stuff, you spend a huge amount of time thinking about evidence. And so, yeah, so these genres change a lot. But anyway, what I started to say is, I think it's about a 4-to-1 I think, now I mentioned I have bad first drafts, but I think I write about 4 times as much as is in the final version. It might even be more than that. For musicians or artists or architects or poets even, we don't have this way of saying, oh, if you wrote a whole lot and or you wrote this song that never went anywhere or something, or you practiced piano and nobody was listening, you practiced tennis and it wasn't a match. We don't see that as wasted time, but we have a tendency to talk about when we've written something that didn't become part of the final version as though it's wasted time. But that really is like saying that, going for a run because you're running a marathon is a waste of time. No, it's not. It's prep. Right? So it's also good if you can think about your writing that way, as it's that, of course, a huge amount of what you generate is not going to be part of your final version. Da Vinci filled notebooks with drawings that weren't part of any final thing. But are we going to say he was a bad artist, right? No. So that's another part of, I think, to sort of be forgiving yourself. One more thing you can look at, which I did as in a particularly dark moment in graduate school, was I took some real heroes of mine and I looked up their dissertations. And they sucked. So, yeah, so it was, the fact that we're so often reading these people who are at the end of their careers means that we hold ourselves to standards that are not really gonna, that don't exactly make sense. Okay, so that's my spiel. And so I was hoping for tons of questions. I have to say, nobody has added to the chat as far as I can see since Kristen. Is that true? Okay, good. Because sometimes, as you guys know, chat doesn't stay up. And Kristen and I talked a bunch about this activity that you guys are going to be doing that I think is really, really wonderful and super, super useful.
Trish, just so that we have it in the recording, would you mind just giving us some quick definitions of what you mean by additive and refutative?
Sure. So refutative says somebody's wrong. It refutes somebody. So it might refute a particular author. And one of the things that a lot of junior scholars will do is refute what's called an outgroup member. So you, for instance, in rhetoric and writing, there are an awful lot of people with very strong opinions about writing who don't read any of the studies on it and all that. And so sometimes an article will say, by a junior scholar will say, here's Stanley Fish. And so it will refute Stanley Fish. That's a very safe position for a junior scholar because Stanley Fish is not well respected. He's not a rhetoric scholar. So you're not going to offend anybody by doing that. Refutative sometimes refutes a theory, a particular study, especially if it's a really monumental study. Additive doesn't necessarily, it's like the trick of shifting but to and. So additive is saying, yes, we've done this work and it's really good and it's really interesting. And I think we'll find out interesting things if we apply it to a new area. Or, which I didn't talk about, another kind of additive work is where you say, here's this, it's sometimes called translation work, but here's this problem that we have in our field. So for instance, I wrote a book about how we, in my field, we talk a lot about freshman composition and democracy and how it's innate, it's teaching citizenship and stuff. But if you know anything about political science, you know that there are different kinds of democracy. There are different models of democracy. And so my argument was, we can have a better discussion in our field by adding in this taxonomy from this other field. Sometimes it's a term from another field or a finding from another field, but that's, that's also something. In education, for instance, there was a moment in time when people were trying to do really complicated quantitative stuff, and it's really hard to do quantitative stuff in teaching. It's very difficult. And somebody said, hey, you know what we should do? We should do an ethnography. And it just blew the field up in really good ways. So that's, and it was a junior scholar who did that. But it's, so that's another kind of additive. You're adding to the knowledge in a way that doesn't say anybody's necessarily wrong. Another one that's kind of like that, since there's somebody doing archaeology, is LIDAR. It's fascinating. I only recently found out about this, but LIDAR is this method that just changes everything as to how people make estimates of population density and building. So it really, really changed the field. The problem with LIDAR, as I understand it, and who is it? Kevin can tell me I'm completely wrong, but is it's expensive. And so it can be really hard for a junior scholar to do that. Ethnography is time consuming. You have to get an IRB, you have to get approval from all the different people. So sometimes these really new methods are challenging.
Patricia, you were saying some really interesting things about differences in tone and verbs and this kind of deferential posture that you might take and how they vary across fields. What do you do to find those things out? You just go read dissertations in that field? Do you read articles, or are there other ways into kind of amassing that knowledge of the genre of your field?
Right, and so one is gossip. And just getting the gossip so for instance, my field is rhetoric and writing, but a lot of my work overlaps with people in rhetoric and communication. The people in rhetoric and communication tend to have had a debate background, and so those journals, although they're publishing extremely similar topics, and I've published in both, those journals are refutative. You come out swinging. You've got your thesis in your introduction. You have to name scholars that you're saying are wrong. In the rhetoric and writing stuff, we're all nice people. Writing center stuff is really this way. We're very nice people. And so you don't name anybody you disagree with, unless it's Stanley Fish, because everybody can hate him. But, so yeah, so some of it is just someone being able to say to you, hey, this is, if you want to publish in Quarterly Journal of Speech, you're going to need to do this. Another thing, though, is looking, but that's why I was saying you want to look at junior scholars' work. There are certain ways in which academia is still in the Middle Ages. And why we have the titles we do and all sorts of stuff. But one of them is it's very hierarchical. And despite the sort of rumors about lefty faculty, we are not very egalitarian. And so people really do expect more deference on the part of junior scholars. There are some fields in which people really don't like junior scholars to invent new words, or, so again, what you're going to want to do is look at journals. And let me say a little bit about the journal thing. So there's, again, not a lot. There are some studies on scholarly productivity that are good. And one of them is for people in a grant getting field. And what it talked about was the fact that people in that field they knew before they were even designing their project who they would go to for a grant. And people who publish a lot in articles, even before they start writing, they're like, where could I get this published? And so they're going to write toward that. And then you can get advice from your advisor about where you want to publish. Some people argue that junior scholars shouldn't be picky, that getting published is what really matters. And so don't necessarily, you want to find out what the rejection rate is for a journal. In one of the top journals in my field has a 95% rejection rate. And it's slow. So it's not a good choice for a junior scholar. You want to know how fast people get things back. Yeah, Kevin, did you have a question? You can tell me I'm wrong about LiDAR.
I did have a question, but Kristen left one in chat before I did, so I'll go after her.
Okay. Where are you? Okay. Oh, okay.
Got it.
Yeah. How do you pick the question? Okay. Oh my God, I could go on about this for so long. I love this question. This is like my superpower, is teaching people how to find the question. Okay. And so what's weird? That's what you want to start with, is what's weird and unexpected. So, given that we've got this consensus, so it's the opposite of what I was saying before. Like, you sit down, you say, what's my answer? So what's known? And here, what I'm saying is you start with what's not known. What doesn't make sense to me? What doesn't, what isn't something that, given how scholarship has gone, we would predict would be happening. Here's what I like about that. And again, anytime anyone gets me to talk about this stuff, I mention this. Oh, Ruthie. But it is, so if I've got this, if I start with an argument and I say, okay, I want to argue that Frederick Douglass had the best understanding of social movement rhetoric of any 19th century rhetor. If I discover that there's a book that makes that argument, my dissertation's gone. It's over. Then I just lie on the floor and watch Breaking Bad for a long time. But if my question is, okay, I'm fascinated by Frederick Douglass. I never heard that he was a great political theorist. But the more I read him, the more I think, actually, he's got some really interesting ideas. If the question I ask is, how does Frederick Douglass's political theory fit in with other political theories of the time? Someone else can write a book on, that's fine. I'm going to have a different argument. Does it make sense? So that's why it's like, if you focus on the question, there are going to be multiple answers to it. So, but yeah, so I think it starts with what's weird. Yeah. Okay, Kevin.
Yeah. And so first off, yes, LiDAR is awesome and is expensive. I'm looking forward to the coming decades as the technology gets cheaper, and eventually you could just do it on a phone or a drone or something like that. That'll be great.
Yeah.
Nearer term with dissertation, I'm curious about the drafting process. So you mentioned the narcissistic pleasures of a first draft, and I was wondering what the general kind of models or appearances of second, third, fourth, etc. drafts are.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, good question. So when you've got a thing with multiple moving parts, like a dissertation, even a chapter, a dissertation chapter is probably going to be the longest thing any of us have written. And so, you come up with a sort of outline, you're going to do these things in a particular order. But then what always happens is there's stuff that needs to be explained to your reader before you can get to something else. And you can't figure out where you're supposed to do that. So one thing about the first and even I would say second draft is that stuff is sort of floating around and you don't know where it is. So when I did a book about the arguments for slavery, TLDR, they were dumb. at some point I was going to have to explain the nullification crisis. I didn't want to start with that because a person picking up a book about slavery is going to be like, why are you telling about the nullification crisis? It actually had a big impact on how people argued about slavery and why they picked that issue and all sorts of stuff, but that wouldn't be, so that like 3 pages floated around. There was a point when I tried it as a long footnote. There was a point when I don't even remember how it ended up. I think it might have ended up of, in order to explain this, I have to go back and explain the nullification crisis. So that's one of the characteristics about, I think, a second draft, is you have a lot of that kind of stuff that your reader needs. So you've got the narcissistic pleasures of the first draft. The second draft is trying to figure out what your argument is. Is this really what I want to say? And then the third draft is when you start thinking about readers and what readers need. Now, for me, I would double that. I would say, I've got 2 that are the narcissists, 2 that are, also what you can do is you will almost certainly, I'm trying to decide how long that story I'm going to tell you, you will almost certainly narrow things. So that book about the arguments for slavery was going to be a book about, and this is not a dissertation, this is a book, right? Third book. It was going to be about the debate generally. And so the rhetoric of pro-slavery, mainstream politicians, pro-slavery kind of marginalized groups, anti-slavery mainstream politicians, marginalized groups, and then these mediators. So 5 chapters. It ended up being about the arguments for slavery between 1830 and 1835. So and there were all sorts of reasons that happened, but one was that one way I wanted to do the book would have required a lot of travel to collections. And at that point in my life, I didn't want to spend 6 months away from my family. So, so I changed the question for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so a lot of people do think about the seminar paper, like each one is a seminar paper. Some that works for some people. It might work for 2 of the chapters and not 2. You might find a dissertation chapter splits in half. That's really, really common for them to split. Also, people think about these things differently. So some people are inductive thinkers and some people are deductive thinkers. And your writing style just needs to fit with whatever works for you. So some people find it really good to start with the evidence. And so you just pick your evidence and you start writing about that evidence. And that gets you to your conclusions. Now, in the final version, you'll probably take your conclusion and move it up, and all that. But at least for the process of writing, some people don't, they're deductive thinkers. And so they really want to know what their argument is. And so they're going to start by, here's my argument. And then they're going to fill in the evidence. I've done both. It just sort of depends on how it works, but there's not just one process for doing this. And you will find, as I said, you might use one process for one chapter and a different process for another. And it just has to do with things like how secure you feel about the claims you want to make. Sometimes when I'm doing closed textual analysis, I'll just get the quotes. I'll create a file where I just put all the quotes in that I want. And now that's really easy to do with, I just lost an, the citation, the library program. It's not EndNote, it's like a good version of EndNote. I'll think about it. You know what I'm talking about, Chris, I'm just being incoherent. Zotero, yes, that's it, it's Zotero. And so you just get all the quotes and then you just write from one quote to the next, and it gets a draft. Okay, Zeeton, yeah. Neaton, sorry, I misread that.
No worries. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Dr. Roberts-Miller. So You raised a very good point about, and I'm especially talking about the additive kind genre of dissertations. And I feel I agree with you, and it really helps me feel a little more comfortable in my own skin when I think of adding to a field when I cannot possibly really know the field. So the thing is that in my case, my field is like really interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. And on top of that, the project or the problem I'm pursuing for my dissertation spans, tries to connect literatures from multiple places. So, and I believe in my department or in my field, I have to write an additive kind of a dissertation. That has to be my argument or contribution. So I need to find, first of all, that voice in this scenario, where on the one hand, I know I can narrow down the scope with my committee, like 3 members, and I can choose 3 fields to try and tie together. But when it comes to the whole department or the whole field, it's even more disparate.
Right.
So just if you could share a few thoughts on how at this stage I can try, and what kind of questions I should be asking people in my department or in my committee to be able to.
Okay, great questions. And I'm going to answer. I might miss that last one, which is super important. So if I do, just remind me. All right. So one way to think about this is someone in my field, a big name in my field, Kenneth Burke, talked about it as being a parlor. Academia is a parlor, and so you're in there and you're chatting with these different people. And first you listen for a while and figure out what the conversation is. And I think a lot of times our contribution might be like, oh my God, that's so interesting. I read this really interesting book. And a person might say, oh, I know that book, right? And you're like, okay, that's fine. It might be, oh, I was talking to people over there and they were talking about this and they made this really, really interesting observation that I hadn't thought about. So if we think about it as like being a good party guest, for some reason, for me, that just kind of lowered the temperature some of seeing it that way, that I'm bringing things together. This book I mentioned that was about the different models of democracy. If a political theorist picked that up, they would be like, what? This is dumb. This is really dumb. Because what mattered, I wasn't contributing to political scientists. There's not a word in there that a political science who teaches, American Politics 101 wouldn't know, right? But it's that I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to the people in my field who didn't know that liberal democracy is a particular kind of democracy, and it's not the only kind. And and that people in political theory disagree about these different models of democracy. So that, does that help? So part of it is, if you're talking to people in information studies, it's whether they know it. It doesn't matter. And yeah, it's pretty unlikely any one of us is going to come up with an insight that somebody hasn't had someplace, right? If only Doug in the I just lost the name of that show. Happy Place? Good Place. There you go. But that doesn't matter. Right. So I think that emphasis that we have on newness and originality comes from modernism. It's a very modernist way to think about knowledge and what knowledge making is. And it has this weird imperialism to it, if you listen, of like there's this unexplored area and we have to investigate it. And of course, the areas were never unexplored. There were people, they were living there, they knew it, and so I feel like that's kind of what we have to think of is, yeah, we're not going to come up with, we're not exploring a new area. There are people there, right? but we might be saying, oh, here, the people here do something that's really interesting for people in this other area. So that's one. The other thing is that, you know, as I said, a good dissertation is one your committee signs. So what's weird about a dissertation, we're good students, right? So we know about pleasing a teacher and we know how to do that. A dissertation, suddenly you're pleasing 3 or 4 people. And that gets really, really confusing. And it's really good if you've got an advisor that you can be open with about that, right? And just talk strategically about what is this person? Is this person going to want me to do something or other? I hope you guys don't mind that I have a potty mouth. But one of my students had this breakdown in writing group. And she said, well, you're going to want me to do this, and this person's going to want me to do that, and this person's going to want me to do that. And I said, I want you to write a fucking dissertation. So she had little buttons made for everyone in writing group that said that. So anyway, so that's one thing. And then, but this is where that question of where you publish, what conferences you go to. And one of the mistakes I made as a junior scholar was to try to go to too many different, like I was trying to go to conferences on environmentalism and rhetoric and American Lit, and you can't. You just, for one thing, it's expensive, but also you can't give all of them all the information that they're going to need. So yeah, so picking something that is more specific, like, okay, I'm going to publish in this kind of journal, this 5 or 6 set of journals. I'm going to publish with this press. I'm going to attend this conference. Yeah.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So what if you're going to conferences in one area, but your committee's in another? It's hard. That was basically my situation. I did my dissertation on John Muir and environmental rhetoric, and there was nobody in my department working on environmental rhetoric. And so it was, my dissertation director was a wonderful human being, but really couldn't give me strategic advice about where to publish, you know, what to be reading. So what I would say is, you know, getting the dissertation signed is your first priority, but network, that's really what's useful about conferences is try to latch onto somebody in another area. Your outside committee member might be good for that, but also you want to think about the job situation. There's no, I was going to try to be politic about it, but I can't. But you want to think about the job situation. So where are you going to get jobs? What kind of jobs are you going to get? And in some areas, it's fine. Like communication is actually a degree that has real world applications. So that's a bit freer, say, than some others. But what I didn't really, it worked out okay for me, obviously, but what I didn't really think through is there weren't any jobs in environmental rhetoric when I finished my dissertation. It was a beginning field. And so I needed to think about what jobs I was likely to get and, you know, and what they would be. So that's another thing to think about. If you've been told that your writing is too journalistic, so one of the books that Kristen mentioned, the one on, I have an academic book on demagoguery and then a kind of a trade book on demagoguery. And the academic book actually flailed for a while because an outside reader at 2 different presses, 2 different outside readers said, this isn't really very scholarly. The issue of demagoguery is dead. I was doing this in 2014. The issue of demagoguery is dead, and essentially it's just too readable. So I had to find a press that wanted that, for one thing. As far as making it less journalistic, journalism is very inductive. So the way that journalism works, and even long form journalism, where there is an argument, you're not supposed to say what the argument is. If you do, you delay your thesis. It's at the very end, and you make it inductively. You know, the story about this person, and the story about this event, and the story about this and that. And so then you get to the end, and you want to do a kind of QED. You know. So it means that you have to have more meta discourse along the way, connections to scholarship along the way, what classical rhetoricians call a partition at the beginning. People sometimes call a map. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this. Those kind of verbs about I'm going to prove, I'm going to show, I'm going to demonstrate, that sort of stuff. I know. I wish those critics were right about demagoguery being dead, but they weren't. But at that point, I mean, I crawl around dark corners of the internet and argue with extremists, so I knew it wasn't dead. But yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Am I going into your time, Kristen? Okay.
No,
Yeah.
you're fine. We're fine.
Yeah. But, you know, and I will say I'm really not a big fan of the, like, you know, here's your thesis at the beginning and then an introduction, and then I'm going to restate it at the end, because for a whole bunch of reasons. But I do know that as a reader, it's kind of comforting for me to get to a point and be like, oh, this is what they were arguing. And so the way that I think of it, and this is what I say to my students and to myself, is it's kind of like in a mystery novel when you get to the end and the detective says, okay, so you're wondering why I've gathered you here. Well, because I figured out who it is, and here's all my evidence, and it's Chester, the dog, the plumber, whatever, the butler. But it's really helpful to have that going through all the evidence and showing restating the conclusion, although probably since somebody has already just confessed, you've figured that out, but you want to know the process of reasoning. So I find it really helpful to think about it as what happens when the detective explains how they got to the conclusion that they did. And as a reader, what's useful about it is that you can be clear that your interpretation was correct. And that's so that you didn't misread. You thought this is what they were arguing. They say, this is what I'm arguing. You can be like, I thought so. Or else like, oh, really? Oops, I need to reread. It also, and I hate to say this, but I will, it makes them easier to quote. If you want to build on somebody's work, you want to add to somebody's work, it's really nice if they've got the one sentence summary of what their argument is. So as a writer, I hate it, but as a reader, I can like it. Yeah.
All right, Trish, we don't want to keep you too long.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today. A really great presentation, a really wonderful resource for all of our writers.
Oh, good. All right, bye.